Humans have been compared to wasps and to bees and to ants, but we're different from these Hymenoptera because they're genetically programmed for sociality. Humans are not. We have, by means of culture, evolved into social animals, despite the fact that we continue to have these translations of belief, both in the Bible, in the Quran. I don't think that we have lexemes, words, in the ancient languages for belief or faith. Those words that are rendered as such actually mean something like faithfulness, commitment, trust, reliability, and then we're down with the very basic social phenomena. You have to protect yourself against predators, you have to find food in a situation that's extremely vulnerable. That calls for a coalition, that calls for a loyalty, that calls for a faithfulness to the other members. I identify with it, I embrace with it. Now, whether it's true in a direct historical sense, I couldn't care less. To think that you could go back to Paul or to Jesus, there is no way to do that. The texts that we have are myths.
Anders Petersen, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So this is going to be an interesting conversation because I think a lot of the people who will listen to this will wonder why we are going to talk about chimps and bonobos. And understanding how chimpanzees relate to the New Testament might not be immediately obvious. Can you talk a little bit about your journey from where I think you started, which is a study of religion, but it was specifically with focus on early Christianity, is that right? And kind of how that evolved to where now you're looking at evolutionary biology and chimpanzees. And I mean, this is a fascinating connection, but can you make that connection for people listening?
I think so. Well, first of all, I was brought up with that sentence in the Odyssey, in which Odysseus finds himself tormented and in a very precarious situation at the island of the Phaiakes, and he stands up and says to himself, "It's for me best to stand up and find out what to search for." That was the maxim of my entire childhood, and I've followed that ever since. So when I've been confronted with problems in the New Testament texts or any other text from late Second Temple Judaism or early Christ religion, I've tried in as much as I possibly could to solve these problems. And if I weren't able to do that, I had to take new paths. And one path that was obvious had to do with representations of feelings. Many of the texts that we're looking at, you take the Gospels, for instance, or you take the Pauline texts, they're about triggering, priming certain emotions and warning against others. Now, if that's the case, you need to know something about emotions and the way that they're conveyed in text as representations of feelings. I never heard one of my professors take the word feeling into his, and at that time it was a he, into his mouth. So I had to go into emotional studies. Then a couple of years ago, I guess a decade ago, I started collaborating with a theoretical sociologist at the University of California, Jonathan Turner, and his wife, Alexandra Mariansky, who is also theoretical sociologist, but is an expert in cladistics, the relationship between modern humans and the other extant apes. And then I increasingly came to realize that human culture is extremely frail, very fragile, and continuously susceptible to erosion and annihilation. And when you then start comparing humans to chimpanzees and bonobos that are our closest cousins in terms of genetics, you realize that they're not particularly social. And I guess as humans, we're wont to say that and to think of ourselves as being very social beings, but in fact, we're not. Our culture, our sociality is of a very thin veneer. It's less than 6,500 years ago that we had the first cities. That's just a splinter second in human evolution. It's about 2% of the lifespan of Homo sapiens on Earth. It's 0.25% of the lifespan of hominins, and considerably less if you're looking at the entire Petersen line, since we split with the last common ancestor with the chimpanzees. Now that means at the depth of our biology, we're not particularly prone for sociality. And that, of course, is a conundrum. How come that we have increasingly come to greater forms of sociality? You now have more than 2 cities in China with more than 22.5 million people. You look at that part of the U.S. eastern coast from Boston and down to Washington, D.C., with almost 60 million people. That's an enormous group of people. How could that have happened within a very short period of time? And that brings me to the question of religion, including also early Christ religion, because I think that we are inclined to think of Christianity, and that goes for other religions as well, as mostly a matter of belief, a matter of faith. I think this is a wrong way of looking at religion. Religion is far more a question of investing your emotions into a shared symbolic storage battery of an emblematic nature, be it a cross or a moon or a half moon or a Torah. And thereby the group comes into existence by sharing certain ideals, values, norms, and rules. Unlike the other extant apes who stayed in the dense forest or in the woodlands, in which they would not be able to engage in more stable forms of sociality because there's simply not enough kilojoule for sustaining large forms of sociality. This is different with our distant ancestors. For some reason, presumably due to scarcity of food, they left the woodlands and appeared in the savanna around 3.5 million years ago. Now, if you're on the open grasslands, you're confronted with a whole new range of selection pressures. You have to protect yourself against predators. You have to find food in a situation that's extremely vulnerable. That calls for a coalition, that calls for a loyalty, that calls for a faithfulness to the other members. It certainly calls for controlling too, that you don't have deceivers, that you don't have free riders. And I think this has very much to do with the emergence of what eventually we call religion, namely that people come into existence as a group by means of sharing certain ideals, values, norms, and rules. Ever since antiquity, you can see it in Aristotle, you can see it in Aesop, you can see it in Virgil, for instance. Humans have been compared to wasps and to bees and to ants. But we're different from these Hymenoptera because they're genetically programmed for sociality. Humans are not. We have, by means of culture, evolved into social animals. And then, of course, I come back now to, for instance, the texts of the New Testament. They're all about promoting certain feelings that are pro-social and subduing other feelings that are antisocial. That's one of the reasons that I came to this. And despite the fact that we continue to have these translations of belief, both in the Bible, in the Quran, I don't think that we have lexemes, words, in the ancient languages for belief or faith. Those words that are rendered as such actually mean something like faithfulness, commitment, trust, reliability, and then we're down with a very basic social phenomena.
So there's a very big difference between belief as an abstract set of truth propositions, first that I'm expected to ascribe to in some way, and faithfulness as a trust in social relationships that I know that if I borrow from you, I have to give back, and you know that, and that sort of thing. So what we're actually talking about here at the grand scheme, we're going to zoom way out in this conversation, we're actually talking about religion as being foundational for human civilization. And the move from small small like tribal groups that can perhaps rely on family kin dynamics, which a lot of our early anthropologists observed, obviously, to the growth of sort of mythic systems that can unite bigger and bigger groups of people together. Is that an accurate kind of description?
Yes, and I think you can see the changes within the history of religions with respect to the scaling up in terms of groupishness, the size of the community that is corollary with the type of religion that we see. A small group of people where everyone knows each other, can control each other, can police each other by means of gossiping. You don't need to have institutionalized police in such a group. When you get the first real large groups of people around the 5th century BCE, when we see the emergence of the first empires, then these groups are confronted with new selection pressures. If you look at something like the great empire of Alexander the Great of the 4th century, that empire stretches from in the Far East, present-day Pakistan and Bangladesh, to in the west, Greece, in the north, the Republic of Macedonia, and in the south down to Bangladesh and the northern part of Africa. Within such an empire, you have more than 160 different ethnicities. How could you possibly control them with a local city god living in his or her temple? This is impossible. So we see a development and evolvement of new ideas about the gods moving up on a vertical scale that is corollary with the expansion of the horizontal scale of the area of sovereignty, and that's basically what can explain the emergence of what eventually evolved into to monotheism. Now we don't find monotheism. At least I don't think that we find monotheism in the Hebrew Bible. We certainly have the ideas about monolatry, that you should only cultivate this one God and be obedient to him. But that is monolatry, it's not monotheism. We also find within, for instance, Greco-Roman philosophical traditions a move towards henotheism, that there is one God and you should concentrate on that particular God. That is not monotheism. Monotheism is something that comes fairly late, presumably with the emergence of early Islam.
So this period in history that has famously been called the Axial Age, this is a time when we simultaneously get all of these empires, all of them driven to some extent needing religion to unite people together. I'm sort of just rephrasing what you've said to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So it's almost what we're hypothesizing here is that religion, and we could talk about the problematic definitions of the word religion, but in some form, a shared mythos or shared religion is essential for the rise of civilization. It would maybe call it a necessary cause for the rise of civilization. Is that an accurate way to say it?
I'm not sure we could call it a necessary cause, but it's certainly a proximate cause.
Okay.
You have the combination. It's difficult to tell what are the ultimate causes, what is the ultimate cause here, and what are the proximate causes. But definitely you have something that places religion at the forefront of development. Now, in saying this, I'm not necessarily insinuating that religion is of a positive value. That all depends on the emotions that the group is investing into that symbolic storage battery, which basically constitutes religion. I mean, you can within a splinter second have a group suffering from very negative emotions, and then a religion, of course, will turn into something rather nasty. It may create social cohesion within the group itself, but with respect to other groups, other members who are not part of, other people who are not part of the group, then of course it becomes highly problematic.
So when we study religion, often, and this is from the predecessor of the study of religion, which was the study of theology, this study lives in humanities departments. We think about the study of religion as being the study of human creativity, maybe, or human, even you think of somebody like Kantian, like phenomenology or something, but we don't really ever think of religion as something that we should be studying using evolutionary biology, for example. Is that right? Is that a mistake? What's the...
No, I think you're absolutely right. But and some of my students will react on this when they first are exposed to my thoughts, and then they're shocked when they find out that I'm actually also a theologian of origin. But I don't see the opposition between the two. A proper form of conducting biblical studies would also include insights from the social sciences and the behavioral sciences and the life sciences, in my view.
So we've essentially built a wall, though, around where we think religion lives, which is, I guess, human, cognition, or maybe even more kind of rudimentary than that, but haven't really looked beyond to these evolutionary impulses that could drive it.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And basically, I mean, it's not coincidental that the term, the concept of religion comes out fairly late in the late 17th century. But that, of course, does not imply that religion as a phenomenon did not exist previously. That's a mistake that many students of religion are making. The problem with such an understanding is that religion is first and foremost thought of as cognitive assertions of a propositional nature, typically also attributed an explanatory character. If that is the way you understand religion, then religion, of course, either comes out as a primitive form, a stupid form of science, or alternatively, if you're entertaining conservative religious views, as something that is superior to science. And I think it's very unfortunate to mold both science and religion into this binary, because I think religion has to do with another form of language, game with other ramifications. In fact, I would go as far as to say we've never seen a human group without religion, but that is religion understood on the basis of sharing certain commitments to particular ideals, values, norms, and rules. And when seen in this light, any ideology, of course, also comes forward as a type of religion that is religion when seen from what I would call a fourth order perspective. But if you're entertaining, for instance, or you're supporting a conservative type of political thinking, or a liberal or a social democratic, you certainly have certain symbols that are very important to you. It's not by chance that the classical definition of religion formulated by Clifford Geertz, the famous U.S. anthropologist in 1966, as religion as a system of symbols that promote, formulate certain pervasive, long-lasting, and powerful moods and motivations by formulating a general order of existence, and clothing it with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations come into existence, that such a definition makes it superfluous, at least in the first instance, to make a distinction between politics and religion, ideology and religion. Then, of course, you can make finer gradations, but then we're down at another level.
Yeah. And even the study of religion as the field has evolved, it was, there's been a famous thing, and my viewers may not even know this, but the study of religion very much at the beginning was Protestants looking at the world and saying, well, we have a God. The Hindus must have a God. The Muslims must have a God. Yeah, they must mean similar things. We can line these up and compare, and that's religion. And famously, a lot of the study of religion in a religious studies department in the last, 60 years, I guess, maybe more than that, has been undoing a lot of this and putting the focus back on what I would describe probably as sociological and anthropological approaches to religion. But these are still not biological approaches to religion. These are still not. Is there still a problem with the way we're even thinking about what religion is, even with all this famous post-structuralist thought that has come into religious studies? We're still studying religion wrong?
I think we are, because basically we're conflating religion, the study of religion, with something different. As soon as you project religion into a binary verging on a dichotomy with science, you come to think of religion in the way that science, that is the natural sciences, are studying what the famous Austrian English philosopher Karl Popper called World One. But religion pertain to something different, namely social interactions between human beings. Now, how can that be studied? In order to be able to understand that, to examine that, you need the humanities, of course. You need a very strong profound historical knowledge, just as you need a knowledge of other cultures. But to have a deep understanding of this, you also need to take the insights from World 2, that is psychology and biology, into consideration. Otherwise, we don't understand some of the problems with which humans are confronted, given our biology. And it's not to say that that part of our biology, what we call culture, because there's another problem here. We tend to think of culture as something different from biology. I don't think this is the case. Joseph Henrich, a famous U.S. psychologist, defines culture as those psychological adaptations that have been driven forward by natural selection for learning by non-genetic means. That doesn't exclude culture from biology, but it constitutes a different system from, say, the behavioral system, from the epigenetic system, and from the genetic systems. Sure. Now, in order to be able to understand the interconnections between these different systems, we as humanists or as social scientists, of course, also need to pay heed to the arguments our colleagues in biology are coming up with, just as they are obliged to do the same with respect to the insights that we can provide them with. And it's also because biology has changed within the last 50 years, so that biologists have increasingly come to understand the profound impact that culture has on the evolution of human beings.
So if I can give an example, because we were in a talk this morning where people were talking about the gift, and this is a famous thing in anthropology, is how do we understand the meaning of the gift, one human giving a gift to another, quite simply. And people have looked at cultural or sociological or anthropological, different kinds of meanings of interpreting that behavior. I listened to your talk. I listened to the questions today. The one thing I didn't hear anybody ask is, when you give me a gift, what does the release of endorphins in my brain from receiving that gift do to our connection? And that's, to me, the bridge that we're missing. It's that we never make that connection between fields, but those are identical in my mind. Is that right? Is that a fair assessment? Or
yes, but I think we also need to understand that we're talking about different levels. I mean, I'm at a department for what's called in a Danish scientific study of religion. I have colleagues who are actually putting people into the brain scanner, doing fMRIs of religious people being exposed to prayer, so we can see what takes place in their brain in terms of secretion of endorphins, oxytocin, serotonin, etc. But there is still a gap that needs to be bridged, and that from brain to mind, and the interactions between these two. Now, obviously, we don't have a mind. Our mind is situated also in our brain, just as we have 12 nerval threads that goes from our brain down to our grand colon. But in order to be able to understand all this, we need to take also these elements into consideration. Now, I don't pretend to be a primatologist. I don't pretend to be a biologist. But at least I've spent enough time to be able to understand the premises under which my colleagues in biology or in primatology or whatever are thinking. And I think that's a genuine form of interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, that's
fair. And I would wish that this is not only confined to the humanities, but we make the move also between the traditional faculty boundaries.
Mm-hmm. So much of this has to do with the artificial way that the universities are divided up. And then in our individual fields, we're often going more and more narrow as opposed to looking beyond interdisciplinary is a bit of a catchword, but a lot of my colleagues just go more and more granular instead of seeing this kind of bigger picture.
Yes, also because we tend to think in terms of the silos in which we are employed. For instance, I think what economists are working on is very much to do with religion. Yeah. But as soon as I approach my economist colleagues and begin talking with them about religion, they say, but this has nothing to do with economy. Yeah. Yes, it does. Yeah. The same thing goes for history, goes for anthropology. And I wish that there would be a much greater openness and understanding to also acknowledge those insights coming from other fields. They may sound slightly strange at first, very foreign to what you're doing, but as soon as you begin to familiarize yourself with them, you also see the benefits you get from that.
Yeah.
And then you can go back to your thick description, to your deep, profound studies of Greek texts, ancient Hebrew texts, Aramaic, Syriac, Coptic, whatever. But it's a both and. Goethe famously said, wer nicht vor 3000 Jahren Rechenschaft zu geben weiß, bleibt im Dunkel unerfahren, mag von Tag zu Tage leben. He who is not able to take account of what has taken place within the last 3,000 years is an amateur. And I basically agree with that. But just as you can be a specialist in certain fields, you also need to open yourself, because otherwise there is a danger that you will never see the forest because of the trees, or the adverse risk that you don't see the trees because of the forest. It should be a both and.
So you started studying chimps a little bit. I know you said you're not a primatologist, but you gave an example yesterday in your talk, and you said you were watching, how many hours of it, of chimpanzee videos?
48 hours.
48 hours. So what did you learn about the foundations of religion from studying 48 hours of chimpanzees and bonobos?
That we actually have proto forms of religion with our closest cousins. Now, this should not come as a surprise, because we already know from corvids, for instance, birds like ravens, jackdaws, and maggots, that they have ritualization. We know it from porpoises, we know it from dolphins, we know it from elephants. And there's nothing strange about this. A famous figure in the history of sociology, the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, said, rien ne vient de rien, nothing comes out of nothing. So it is to be presupposed that we already have existing building blocks on which we can build further. Now, this is the way that I have been very interested in a study that came out in 2016, published in Science Report by Jan Marcul and 78 other authors who had observed chimpanzee populations by setting up hidden cameras in Western Africa. And here we see chimpanzees taking up rocks, which they, under normal circumstances, would not do, and carry to certain trees, while also being very agitating, jumping up and down, making these famous hooting sounds. And they leave the rocks there, but they also return to these trees with rocks after time are piling up. They clearly have an acknowledgement of territory. Now, that is a very pivotal central element in religion as well.
And we've been spending all our time, I think, in maybe not as much recently, but the foundations of our field is based on the idea that this is something frankly, I think the foundation is based on the idea this is something God gave to humans, and therefore it separates us from the animals. But in reality, we're...
Now, if you come from the study of religion, I mean, the assertion or the idea that God gave religion to humans may be very meaningful within the context of a religious language game. But if you're committed to the science and to the university, you can, of course, only study it in terms of seeing it as human culture. That is, humans making, presenting, endorsing ideas, representations about the gods.
Fair. Let's talk about one of the really interesting things that you talked about. We just mentioned it a minute ago, but the idea that as civilizations grow, the gods move up. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's kind of played out in the last, could I say 2,000 years, 3,000 years, just kind of broadly? Because we've seen the rise of bigger and bigger empires, globalization in which these come into contact, and then ultimately where we stand now is the concern over splintering of our society. Can you just talk me through some of those kind of things?
Well, you previously referred to the so-called Axial age discussion that began in the late 18th century, but has become increasingly popular from the beginning of from the last part of the 1940s, when German philosopher Karl Jaspers gave a speech in Geneva in the beginning of September 1946. in which he, after the Second World War and all the atrocities that had been committed during the Second World War, spoke about a rebuilding of world and European identity, and there he coined the term Axial Age. The interesting thing about this is that we see from around the 6th, 5th century BCE in certain parts of Eurasia, in China, in India, in Greece, and in Israel, very comparable developments. And the question is, of course, why do we see that? Why does this take place at this particular period and at this particular geographical realm? I think it should be seen as a convergent form of evolution in which people increasingly, or elitists increasingly, come to think of this as a way of moving beyond kith and kin, as a way of moving beyond traditional urban forms of religion, because you're part of a greater world, which is the reason that I talk about this not as Axial Age religion, but as a cosmos form of religion. And I think it's a reaction to the reciprocal reaction to the emergence of empires. And then, of course, you could raise the question: so why didn't this take place at first with this new form of imperial religion? Well, the people in power are not likely to be the ones undermining their own power stance. So this comes from what an American anthropologist, sociologist, Seth Apperton has called the social entrepreneurs. Elitists who are in the fringes of the power but would like to get a hold of the cake or the power. And they are the ones developing these new ideas where you can clearly see representations of the gods ascending on a vertical scale. So it's no longer the local god, but a god who is omnipotent, who is omniscient and omnipotent. He can look into your bowels, he can look into your soul, and the whole idea is that you yourself should transform your entire life as if it were a continuous, perpetual coaching program or a fitness center in which you're striving as much as you possibly can to undergo processes of divinization. We see that in the context of Jainism, of Buddhism, partly Hinduism. We see it in the context of Greek philosophy. And of course, a very vulgarized version of this, and by vulgarized, I don't mean it in a negative way, I mean it as a democratization of what originally was thought of in elite circles, is disseminated to a much wider group of people, is what I think takes place in the context of early Christ religion. It was not by chance that the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche spoke about in a book he wrote in 1886, Jenseits von Gut und Böse, Beyond Good and Evil, about early Christianity being a Platonism for the people, denn das Christentum ist Platonismus für das Volk.
So these kind of, you could argue that the bigger, conceptually bigger and further out religion is, the more, could I say, the more likely to succeed? Is that too optimistic? Or is there an essence that Christianity had a better chance than some comparable phenomenon that required a local temple or a pilgrimage to somewhere or something?
Well, eventually it did outcompete the others, as did the other world religions too. And I mean, that is not by chance, because we see similar patterns. And if you have patterns, you of course need to come up with one form of explanation rather than another. And one reason that these religions seemed very strong was apparently that they also appeared more persuasive to people. Of course, the traditional forms of religion did not disappear from the one day to the other. We know that with the Constantinian turn, and later at the end of the 4th century, when Theodosius I made Christianity the only legitimate religion within the Roman Empire, that was not the end to the Greco-Roman temples, but eventually they did vanish, they did disappear. And I think it has to do with this aspect of the cosmos type of religion, that they are more fit, they are more persuasive to a world that includes not only a genetically proximate group of people, but includes a much wider span of people just as it covers a much wider area. Now, you could, of course, ask the question, so what about these other elitist forms of the cosmos type of religion, say Platonic philosophy or Stoicism, for instance? Yes, these do represent a form of religion, although we call them philosophy. But they're without that more popular aspect. They don't have very evolved ritual systems, and that you also need, because if we're talking about religion, understood as those ideals, norms, rules, and regulations that constitute a certain group of people, you would still need to be able to get some access to the ideas, some access to the values and norms, and that's where you get the rituals that are conveying what we could call magical efficacy or religious efficacy to you. How do you get actually in touch with this very distant God, which is one reason that monotheism as such will never succeed unless as a dream of theologians, because in practice it is impossible, simply because if you have the God ascend on a very high vertical scale, eventually what happens is that God becomes irrelevant. So there needs to be some kind of balance between the high position of the Godhead, and on the other hand, also allowing people to get access to that God and the boons that God can possibly grant you.
Wow, that's fascinating. I have another question, but before we go there, maybe so what we're talking about is the ethical underpinnings, or the kind of shared social imaginary, maybe we could call it, or maybe biological reality.
Yeah, I like to talk about this as a form of shared ontology, that which allows us to be part of a group, and that group to persist by means of sharing certain values, norms, rules, and ideals.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think there's kind of two reactions somebody might have listening to all this. On the one hand, somebody might say, well, there you go, religion's not real. And on the other hand, you might say, well, religion's one of the most real things about us, and maybe an essential part of being human. I think a lot of the conversations I hear fall into that first camp. People thinking that the whole goal of studying religion, or is to become an atheist, or to have to prove your belief propositions or disprove them, or something. But what you're talking about is something a lot more, I find it a lot more interesting. I'm sure it's challenging to people, but I find it a lot more interesting to see religion as an essential part of our humanity. Can you say something about that? Like, how does that split happen? You famously said your students always ask you, so you must be agnostic, or sorry, you must be atheist, right? And you have a good answer to that. So I'd be curious to know how we confront that kind of, I think, dichotomy maybe that's being constructed, and how it's a product of our how we think about religious knowledge, I think, maybe.
Yes, I mean, it's a result, it's a product of a type of thinking that came out of the 17th, 18th century, basically with Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Now, I think the trap to fall in is to say that given the study of religion, you make religion superfluous. It comes out as projections of our own imagination, of our own wishes, of our own hopes. Well, that is absolutely true when religion is looked upon from the perspective of science. And that is a very fair perspective. But then humans have always been oscillating between different representations of reality, between different language games. If you're standing at a grave and one of your beloved ones has to be buried, science will help you very much in consoling the people. That's one important function of religion. If you're in the academy, the world is different and looks differently. So you have to pay heed to these different language games and the ramifications and the constraints that they have, and different ways that we're behaving. I mean, I can say for my own part, I behave one way when I'm in stadium watching football, that is European soccer. I behave another way when I'm standing as a professor in my auditory, teaching my students. And I think it's a richness of human life that we have these different language games, and that we can pendulate between them. I also think then that it's a misunderstanding to assume that this is something that came out with modernity and secularity. I think the extent to which we're able to think about this and reflect upon it is considerably higher today than it was, say, 2,000 years ago. But we should never forget that telling a story about a man being able to walk on a lake is not the same as claiming that this person actually walked on the lake. These are two different things. And people in antiquity were also able to make these very basic distinctions, because there may be different ways of representing the world, talking about the world, but the world as such is one. So that implies that if people are not able to walk on water today, they were not able to do it 2,000 years ago. But that doesn't exclude the fact that you might tell a story about someone being able to do that, but it has some other purposes than actually making an assertion about a figure being able to walk on water.
There have been those throughout history that I think, and right down to the present day, who think that the goal of the academy is primarily to get rid of religion or transcend it, or to some sort of utopian world where we no longer have or need religion. Is that possible? I mean, given what you're arguing, it seems like religion is almost fundamental part of our flourishing as well then. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, but I think you have to add two qualifications. First, if that were the purpose of the academy, then the academy would be suffering from megalomania. Second, now you can't make religion superfluous, because any group, given our evolutionary background, given our in-depth biological nature, needs to share certain ideals, values, norms, rules. Now they of course change, and the way they are expressed changed with the course of history. But the very fact that we have this shows that religion does not escape. Even if you look at the most dire organizations of atheism, I also see that as a form of religion.
Yeah, that's fair. That's an excellent discussion we won't get into right now. But one of the things that I think I'm curious about, because a lot of people are confused by this, that I still practice religion and I still call myself a Christian. I'm quite comfortable with that label, and people have assumptions about what that means. But it seems to a lot of people a contradiction when I'm undoing things that are apparently supposed to be received sacred religious knowledge and saying, well, the Bible has mistakes, or this is, we can understand history, whatever. And it seems fundamentally at odds with still belonging to a tradition. And the other thing that I've come across is a lot of people saying, well, the goal should be to get rid of, Chalcedonian Christianity and get back to what Jesus believed and follow that. And I've been quite comfortable saying, I don't want to follow the religion of Jesus. I don't want to be like one of his first followers. I'm quite comfortable being a 21st century Christian because that's my social reality. That's where I belong. That's religion helps me make sense of myself in this world. This is turning into less of a question, more a comment. But I think what talking this through with you has given me a really appreciation for what I've been trying to say, that to talk about religion or even Christianity as a reality does not mean to say that the abstract truth propositions that we can or can't know anyways about the Trinity or something are true. But in a very different way, it's almost truer. It's still a very real part of us. Is that fair? And I'd be curious to hear your reflections on how you still relate to the tradition.
I would very much agree. I think religion, although current forms of Christianity, is very much an identification or an embracement of a tradition, and that's fine. But that also goes for other forms of traditions that are also very important. I have a background in the U.S. Many years ago. I was an exchange student in North Dakota back in 1987, 1988. That was just around the celebration of the bicentennial of the Constitution. We had to learn it by heart, just as we had to learn the Declaration of Independence by heart. Now that's also part of my legacy. That's part of my heritage. I identify with it. I embrace with it. Now, whether it's true in a direct historical sense, I couldn't care less, because there's also another question here To think that you could go back to Paul or to Jesus, there is no way to do that. The texts that we have are myths. They are not a portrayal of what actually took place. That's a complete misunderstanding that again came out of the 19th century, late 18th century, to think of the texts that are foundationally mythic texts as if they were portrayals of something that really took place. It's this conflation again of science and religion. Then what do we then do about these texts? Of course, it's not a matter of returning to some form of thinking about these texts that existed 2,000 years ago or 1,900 years ago that could not possibly take place. Because there's another very important dimension to this. The question about what the text, what the tradition has to tell us today, what we can learn from that tradition, cannot be dissolved from the question what we as modern people can tell that tradition. So there's a constant negotiation, and that's the way it should be. Now, if I were to formulate this more piously, then you could make the argument that Christianity is ultimately a story about God incarnating himself in history. If this is the case, that God has also accepted that her religion depends on the interpretations of human beings. He has, so to say, given carte blanche, a blueprint to allowing humans to come up with all signs, with all kinds of history, with all kinds of stories, with all kinds of ideas, and some will be sifted through history, and that's very fine.
In closing, the thing that you hinted at in your lecture yesterday as well that was quite interesting to me is the splintering of society. And what we have, this video is going to go out to people because of the way the algorithm works. Most of them are primed to agree with me, to agree with you, to, we fit within a conversation they want to have. The internet is having this reaction on us now that we are able to kind of lose the shared mythos is no longer there. We don't share this anymore. We're splintering into tribes or splintering into, and these are not tribes generally, as far as I can tell, based on ethnicity. I mean, you could talk about white nationalists or something, but these are more often tribes that are based on psychographics, I think. But we'll still have the same splintering effect. Is that fair? Like, what are we at risk of by losing that kind of shared mythology that has built civilization in your estimation?
Well, we lose our own connection with our past, and that makes us more stupid than we're allowed to be. The second thing is that, and in that regard, I would evoke another tradition which goes back to Enlightenment, because Enlightenment is not about attacking religion. Enlightenment is about eradicating religion of those more problematic traits by calling attention to the importance of reasoning. And reasoning is exactly what allows us to be able to talk also with those other people with whom we disagree, in order to avoid that we're standing at each pole of a spectrum shouting at each other. The only thing that could possibly unite us and allow and enable a form of civilized cohabitation is that we can get together despite our disagreements and find a common platform on which we can talk to each other. And that's what reasoning and reason is about. Because having continuous recourse to our own emotions won't bring us anywhere in the world.
Beautiful. Anders, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.